start off, I wanted to maybe ask you to recall some people that maybe for a long time you used to look up to, and you don't have to say anything out loud. In fact, I prefer you didn't. But think about somebody that maybe you used to look up to when you were younger, that you would look at them and think they're infallible, or maybe they've done no wrong and they could do no wrong, and then they made a mistake that just changed the way you look at them forever, right? Maybe they made such a colossal mistake that nobody can look at them the same way, that they're not infallible, they're imperfect, and in fact, horribly imperfect. Maybe you know some people like that. You used to have heroes that fell. Some of them fell pretty hard. And in the Bible, there's a lot of people that are like that for a long time people look up to them, or even today we still look up to them, and then we read that one mistake they made and go, ugh. Yeah, it's different. Probably one of the most infamous examples is David and Uriah. And we're going to talk about what happened to David that made him do this horrible, awful thing that he did. Maybe you're familiar with the story. We're going to look at it from a slightly different perspective. Most of the time we call this story David and Bathsheba, or the incident with Bathsheba, but I want to look at it more about what he did to Uriah. And I know that's part of the story, but I really want to focus on his relationship with Uriah. And we're not going to read the entire story. We're going to hit highlights, and I'll try to fill in the details. But starting in 2 Samuel 11, verses 2 through 4, it says, "It happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and someone said, 'Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?'" So just so everyone knows, for context, being on a rooftop in the evening was incredibly common at the time. They built houses and buildings with flat rooftops so that you can go up on them, because they didn't have air conditioning. They didn't have, central heat and air. So in the evenings, they would sometimes go up to the rooftops because it was cooler up there than inside the house that had been baking in the sun all day. It was also not uncommon to be bathing in public or in open spaces like courtyards or rooftops. So nothing happening here is totally uncommon. It is today, but we have a lot of luxuries that they didn't have back then. So nothing here going on is uncommon, but David sees what's going on here. He sees this woman bathing on a rooftop, and he wants her. He ends up taking her and doing things that he should not have done. And she comes back later on and tells him, "Hey, I'm pregnant. By the way, my husband's at war, the war that your people are fighting." So David's trying to cover this up. He sends for Uriah and brings him back. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, he took her, lay with her, yeah. He gets Uriah, who's in battle, takes him back, and when Uriah had come to him, verse 7, David asked how Joab was doing, how the people were doing, how the war prospered, hey, how's it going? Trying to, make sure Uriah's not, I don't know, I guess he's trying to make Uriah feel like, I'm just want news from the battlefield. And David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah departed from the king's house, and a gift of food from the king followed him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. So you see, David's trying to cover up what's happened. And he's trying to make it seem like, okay, so Uriah went home, he was with his wife, so that child must be Uriah's. He's trying to cover this up and make it seem like I had nothing to do with it. But Uriah's so cool. I mean, he's such a good dude. So he comes back, he's in the king's house. David tells him, "Go home, relax, rest, be with your wife." Uriah sleeps on the ground in front of the king's house. And David asked him, "Why didn't you go home? Why are you still here?" And he said, "The Ark of the Covenant's on the battlefield, so is Joab, and so are my brothers. What right do I have to go home and relax?" That's so cool. He's such a loyal soldier, and we'll see later on how loyal he really was, but he's such a good soldier. And even David, for a second night, he gets him drunk, And he tells him, go home, and still Uriah refuses to go home, even while intoxicated and not thinking straight. He said, I will not go home while the ark of God is on the battlefield and my brothers are on the battlefield. So David makes a horrible choice, and he has Uriah murdered. In 2 Samuel 11:15, he wrote a letter, and he gave it to Uriah, by the way. He gave it to Uriah and said, go back to Joab, give this to him. The letter said, set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle and retreat from him that he may be struck down and die. So still trying to cover all this up, he sends Uriah back to Joab with his own death warrant, or his own death certificate. And in the heat of battle, Joab pulls his men back and makes sure Uriah's killed. And in the process, ends up killing a lot of people. Because in order to do this, they basically walked up to the wall of Ammon, which is who they're fighting with. They're fighting with Ammon. And a lot of people get killed there because they're just shooting fish in a barrel, just picking them off right by the wall. And Joab even tells a messenger, when you go to David and you tell him how the battle fared, and he asks you, why were you so close to the wall? Don't you know that that's dangerous? Just tell him Uriah's dead and you'll be fine. And it worked. This messenger goes to David and tells him, hey, the battle did not go well. A lot of people died because we were so close to the wall, but don't worry, Uriah's dead. And David was happy. And David thinks he got away with it. In verse 26 of chapter 11, when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. When her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Now that Uriah is out of the picture, he's married Bathsheba. Now everything's covered. It's all good. It's all legitimate now. None of that other stuff happened before. It happened after we were married. And he thinks he got away with it. Until a prophet named Nathan came to him and told him this story about these two men. One man had plenty of sheep. One man only had one. The one that had one loved that sheep. He cared for it as though it was his own child. Then the man with a lot of sheep had a friend come over, and instead of slaying one of his sheep, he took the sheep from the man that only had one. And he killed it and gave it to his friend. And David's upset. He's angry. He says, who is this man? He should be put to death. He should be thrown in prison. A lot of projection going on. A lot of projection. And in chapter 12 and verse 7, Nathan said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your keeping, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have given you much more. You could have had anything you wanted, and you decided to take a woman that was not yours, that belonged to somebody else, and have that man killed. Then David's upset. Then David understands what he's done. I think he understood all along, but now he realizes the consequences are catching up with him. And he writes a psalm that was what that song that Connor just led is based off of. About how he's very upset with what he's done. He's very sorrowful, and he's sorry, and he's asking for forgiveness, asking for a clean heart. And in the process, his child dies that Bathsheba gives birth to. So how did this happen? This man that the Bible calls the man after God's own heart, the best king Israel ever had, in my opinion. There were several good kings, but David was the best. How in the world could this have happened to David? The man who wrote Psalms about how much he loves God and loves the law, and how? It all started here sorry, I missed that one. 2 Samuel 11, verse 2. It happened one evening that David arose from his bed, walked on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. Here's where it started. He saw. Now, it could have ended right there. He could have looked away. He could have gone inside. But instead, he decided to behold. and to look and to watch. It was a lack of self-control that started this. It was him deciding, I'm not going to control my eyes or what I look at. I'm just going to let my flesh do what it wants to do. It was a decision. A decision to not control himself. In Ecclesiastes 1 and verse 7 says, all the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. All things are full of labor, men cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. So Solomon, David's son, actually writes this, and he says, the sea is never full, even though rivers flow into it constantly. It's never full, and so are the eyes. They're the same way. We can get information we can see as much as we want. I know we have phones that will show us anything we want to see, and yet we still want to see more. And it doesn't matter the subject. We always crave more to look at. The eyes are never satisfied with seeing. And David looked, and he looked, and he watched, and he decided that wasn't enough, because he could not control his eyes. In Matthew 5, verse 28, it says, I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. David should have done anything he could to stop. He should have looked away. He should have gone inside and bore the heat of the house rather than on the cool of the rooftop. He could have made bathing on rooftops illegal if he wanted to. He's king, for crying out loud. He could have done all of that. And he should have done something, but he didn't. He couldn't control himself. I want to notice something too here, what a lack of self-control will do to a person. We see here in verse 3, or David asks, who is this woman? Someone said, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? If he couldn't stop at looking, he should have stopped at the word wife. Because he knows that person is a wife of somebody else. And he knows the law. Exodus 20 verse 14 says, you shall not commit adultery. This is the 10 Commandments. This is the laws that all of them would have known. In verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. He knows these laws. In Psalm 1 and verse 1, David himself writes, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He himself writes about all the things he loves about God's law. In one psalm he says, they're sweeter than honey. He loves God's law, and yet his lack of self-control lets him commit sin and break that law and commit adultery and covet another man's wife. Suddenly the law doesn't matter. In Romans 13 and verse 9 says the commandments say, for the commandments you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other command, all are summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Do you think David hated Uriah? I don't think so. In fact, we'll look at Uriah here in a minute, and we'll see that David had no reason to hate Uriah. He didn't love him either. He didn't love Bathsheba. Now, it doesn't say that Bathsheba was a willing or unwilling participant in this sin. I tend to think she was willing because it doesn't say that she was unwilling. But this was not a loving act to Bathsheba either. She's committing adultery just the same as he is, and it was his idea. There's no love in this story. And he's broken so many laws and so many commands, but it didn't matter. In a moment of weakness, in a moment of a lack of self-control, the laws, the rules, and what you believe is true and what you want in your heart to follow God doesn't matter. Let's look at another thing here in verse 3. Something else that should have stopped him. Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Now, for a long time, I thought this story was bad enough because I thought Uriah was just some random guy in Israel, some random soldier. That's not the case. Uriah is mentioned another time, 1 Chronicles 11. Now, we're not going to read all of 1 Chronicles 11. It's a lot of names. But in verse 10, this opens up with were the heads of the mighty men whom David had, who strengthened themselves with him in his kingdom, with all Israel to make him king, according to the word of the Lord concerning Israel. So a little bit of backstory here. David is not king of Israel yet. He's just king of Judah after Saul dies. Judah accepts David as the king. The rest of Israel wants Saul's son Ishbosheth to be king. So David is now trying to conquer Israel and take it from Ishbosheth because that's what God has commanded him to do. And he has a group of men that First Chronicles lays out here who are mighty men. In verse 26 says, also the mighty warriors, so this isn't commanders, but just warriors, were Asahel and Elhanan, not important names right at this moment, but he's listing all these mighty warriors that David knew that were with David conquering Israel, possibly even before then, but at least they were with him to conquer Israel while he was king of Judah. And look who's mentioned in verse 41, Uriah the Hittite. He is named as one of David's mighty men before he's king of Israel. This wasn't some random guy. This is someone who had David's back in war with his own people. Someone who believed that David should be king and fought for him. Who went to war countless times, willing to die for David's cause. Who did die for David's cause. This wasn't a random guy. This was a loyal soldier for David. And David took his wife and he murdered him. If it wasn't bad enough, and on top of that, David knew how that felt for someone else to have your wife. In 2 Samuel 3, verse 12, this is before David is king of Israel. He's conquering Ishbosheth's land. And Abner was an advisor. There's the word. He was an advisor for Ishbosheth. Well, he was mad at Ishbosheth because they had a disagreement. And he goes to David and he says, I'm going to work with you now. What do you want? Abner sent messengers on his behalf to David, in verse 12 of 2 Samuel 3, who is the land, saying also, make your covenant with me, and indeed my hand shall be with you to bring all Israel to you. And David said, good, I will make a covenant with you, but one thing I require for you, or of you. You shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see my face. A little bit more backstory here. When David was on the run from Saul, because Saul hated him. Saul wanted to kill David. David had to escape multiple times. But while he's out on the run from Saul, Saul gives David's wife, Michal, to somebody else, to some other guy, and says, this is your wife now, not David's. And David apparently knows about this. So when he's coming to Israel and he's trying to become king, Abner says, what do you want? He says, I want my wife back. Continuing on, it says, so David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Another fun story, but we'll skip that. Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, from Paltiel, the son of Laish, And then her husband went along with her to Bahurim, weeping behind her. So Abner said to him, go return, and he returned. So David knew what it felt like for someone else to have your wife. He understood that. And yet, he took his friend's wife, his loyal soldier's wife. And I did a little bit of research on this, and if you know more than me, then correct me if I'm wrong, but conservatively, scholars estimate that David had been king for 15 years before David took Bathsheba. 15 years he's been king. 15 years Uriah has been fighting for him. David knows how this feels, and yet he takes this loyal soldier, his friend's wife, for himself. Because of a moment of a lack of self-control. Proverbs 18 and verse 19 says, a brother offended is harder to win than a strong city, and contentions are like the bars of a castle. I think David knew his relationship with Uriah was over. Or at least he thought that. I think he understood that if Uriah was to find out about this, it wasn't going to be good for them. That it was going to be very, very hard to get Uriah back on his side. It's possible that there are many wars fought after this, even civil wars in Israel. It's possible that because of this incident, if Uriah had been allowed to live, that he might have joined the other side. I don't know, but neither did David. In Proverbs 6 verse 32 says, whoever commits adultery with a woman lacks understanding. He who does so destroys his own soul. Wounds and dishonor he will get, and his reproach will not be wiped away. For jealousy is a husband's fury. Therefore he will not spare in the day of vengeance. He will accept no recompense, nor will he be appeased, though you give many gifts. You know who wrote this? David's son, the son of Bathsheba. You think David understood that? That when you do this to somebody, that relationship is very likely to be done, to be destroyed. I think that's why he had him. I think that's why he was covering it up the way he was. So there's some political reason as well. But I think he was afraid to face the consequences with Uriah. That was at least a part of it. So instead of coming clean and confessing like, well, we'll get to that. I'm jumping ahead of myself. I apologize. So what David does instead of dealing with his own issue is he has Uriah killed. He sends a letter to Abner saying, let him be struck down and die. Yet another commandment that he is completely forsaken, completely disregarded, and he has Uriah, his friend, killed. When Nathan brings it up, he said, you had him killed even with the swords of your enemies. Talk about merciless. You allowed the enemies of Israel to do whatever they wanted to him. There were a lot of people that hated Israel and would have done a lot of bad things to their soldiers and to their kings. In fact, you read that in 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings. You find kings that were taken, had their eyes gouged out, and were beaten and tortured and then killed. And there was no mercy here from David. David had no mercy for his friend, even though he was the one that did wrong. And he committed murder. Here's what he should have done. In Matthew 5, verse 23, he says, therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. What David should have done from the very beginning is he should have stopped looking, right? Stopped looking, stopped wanting her whenever he found out she was married, when he found out she was married to his friend. But then after it happened, what he should have done, very first thing, is tell Uriah. That should have been number one thing he did. And then when Bathsheba found out she was pregnant and told him, you know what he should have done? Tell Uriah. When Uriah came to him and refused to go back down to his house, you know what he should have done? He should have told Uriah. Instead, he had it killed because he didn't want to face the consequences of his actions. Remember Jordan, during our meeting, one of the things he said was a lot of sin that we commit is because of self-preservation. We want to preserve ourselves. David's wanting to preserve his image, maybe. Or maybe he's trying to preserve his relationships. Maybe he's just trying to make sure Uriah doesn't turn against him and try to kill him, or even just get mad and never be a soldier again, or even just lose a friend. Whatever it is, he's trying to preserve himself. And he loses a friend and commits murder. You see one more verse here. Proverbs 28 verse 1 says, "The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion." You know, recently on my way to Sooner one evening when they had their last meeting, there's maybe you guys have been there, you've seen this, but there's a street that you have to go down that the church is on that you have to drive for quite a while that's got stop signs every mile or so, and the speed limit's 55 and the sun is right here. I blew past one of those stop signs, I'll be honest. I didn't see it until I had already passed it because it was just a silhouette. And I didn't mean to, but for the entire rest of the drive there, I had my hands on the steering wheel correctly. I was checking my mirrors, making sure there were no blue and red lights behind me. No one was after me. But I know I did wrong. I know I messed up, and there could be consequences to that. That's what David's doing. Nobody knows about this except him and God and Bathsheba. Now, at the time, he's not thinking about God, of course, obviously. But he's doing everything he possibly can to make sure those consequences don't catch up with him. And I ended in murder. You see what a lack of self-control can do to a person? One moment, one mistake, cascaded over and over and over into this. And David has done something he probably thought was unthinkable because of a moment of no self-control. Proverbs 25 and verse 28 says, "Whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls." Whenever we cannot control ourselves, we're leaving ourselves wide open to Satan. We have no defense against temptation, against lust. Whenever we refuse to allow the Word of God to work on us, whenever we refuse to put our flesh down and elevate our spirit, we're a city broken down without walls. And 1 Peter 5:8 says, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world." David left himself wide open, and Satan feasted. Satan ate him up in that moment, in that story. David's thoughts are far away from God. All he's thinking about is what he wants, what he can do, what he can get away with. And Satan's having a field day with the most powerful man in Israel. When we cannot or refuse to control ourselves, Satan can and he will devour you. That's how important self-control is. It doesn't matter how many verses you memorize. It doesn't matter how many times you go to church. It doesn't matter how many times or how many songs you've memorized from our hymn books or anything like that. If you have no self-control, you will fail and you will fall. And maybe fall just as hard as David did. In James 4 and verse 1 says, "Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasures that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war yet you do not have because you do not ask. A lack of self-control destroys relationships. It did with David. It will with you. When you can't control your feelings, maybe your anger, right, kids? We talked about that on Friday. When you can't control your anger, what it leads to. It can lead to killing somebody. Could. Don't think it can't. It destroys relationships. When you take from somebody else because I want that, and you refuse to control that desire, it could even lead to you just not liking that person or hating that person because of what they have. It has devastating consequences. So what does it take to have self-control? What could David have done better? In James 3 and verse 7 says, every kind of beast and bird or reptile or creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. You know, it's going to take work. It's going to take strength to learn how to control yourself. And James, he's not even really talking about controlling what you do. He's controlling about what you say. And he's talking to teachers, men that, like I'm doing now, stand up in front of congregations and they preach the Word of God, and he's telling them, you need to figure out how to control what you say. Because it has devastating consequences when you don't. To teachers, to men who have influence in congregations, that you think it's any different for people who aren't teachers? You think it's any easier to control what you say when you don't have a public platform? If anything, it's harder because you're not watching everything you say, right? I know even for me, there's been a lot of times that I walk away from a conversation and I go, why did I say that? What in the world possessed me to say that? It's hard. It's going to take strength. It's going to take practice. And James is saying it's not easy. It is not going to be easy to figure out how to control what you say, much less what you do or what you think. If it's hard enough to control what you say, imagine how hard it is to control what you think and you feel. There's no excuse. It's just going to take work. It's going to take strength. Proverbs 16:32 says, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. The amount of power and diligence and strength it takes to rule your own self, your feelings, your desires, your lusts. The writer of Proverbs here is saying you're stronger than people that overthrow cities. Alexander the Great was an amazing person. Not a morally amazing person, but as far as his accomplishments go, he was an amazing person. If you read into Alexander the Great, you'll see that he took over the known world by the time he was 32. 32. It took him 10 years to conquer the known world. That's amazing. That takes power. That takes diligence and effort. And here, Proverbs is saying if you control your own spirit, you are just as mighty, if not mightier, than Alexander the Great. That's how much strength it takes. And it's going to be rough. It's going to be hard. But it's got to be done for your sake and for the sake of those around you. Of all people, David should have had the strength. He should have been able to stop himself because he has conquered cities. He's conquered himself before. You remember when he was on the run from Saul, Saul found him a couple of times. Well, not found him, but he found where David was a couple of times. And David had an opportunity to kill Saul and end his troubles right there, but he stopped himself and his men. He could. He could control himself. But in this one moment, he failed. And to be fair to David, he'd had several wives up to this point. He's had several women around him up to this point. He's not practicing self-control with them, with who he marries. So in that moment, he sees this woman he wants, and he's weak. That's the strength it takes. It takes a lot of strength, a lot of effort, a lot of practice. In 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 24, it says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate," or controlled, self-controlled, "in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air. I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to others, I myself should become disqualified." You know, Olympic athletes don't wake up one day and decide they're Olympic athletes. I mean, I guess some of them do, but they don't do very well. But the Olympic athletes that do well, Usain Bolt, right? Michael Phelps, all the other ones. They don't just wake up one morning and decide they're Olympic athletes. They've trained for years. They have put their bodies through pain, through training, so that they can run that race, so they can swim that race and be the best. And that's what Paul is saying here. If we want to obtain that imperishable crown, that one that won't fade away, we got to be just as disciplined. We have to train. We have to prepare. We have to fight like our lives depend on it, because you know what? They do. Your eternity hinges on your ability to control yourself. So we got to work at it, at the little things. I've tried fasting before. I'm not good at it. Because even at work, like 10:30, I'm hungry and I want to eat. And by 11, I'm hurting because of how much I want to eat. And I've joined a new company and they changed the lunchtime on me. So now it's noon instead of 11:30. And that 30 minutes is torture. But to fast, you have to have the self-control and discipline to say, I will go through the pain and bear it. And it takes that with the small things. So that when the big things come, you're able to deal with that pain and bear it patiently and have patience. But it takes practice. It takes work. 1 Peter 2 and verse 11 says, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, that they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation." No, this is a war. This isn't just a sprint or, I can flip a switch and have self-control one day and then turn it off the next day, and I could just leave it constantly on and always be. This is a war. This is an uphill battle. And it's one we've got to constantly fight. We have to fight our urges, fight our desires, fight our lusts, and abstain from fleshly things. Stay away from it. As much as possible, stay away from it. And when you can't stay away from it, control yourself. Fight against it. In Galatians 5, verse 24 says, "Those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit." You need to be able to kill your desires and your lusts. Put them to death. Crucify them. It takes work. And a lot of it. A lot of practice. We sometimes read these stories in the Old Testament, like Isaiah was talking about around the table, about how we look at them and we go, man, how in the world could they have done that? They watched the Red Sea part. Why in the world are they doubting him now, right? David has everything he could ever want. Why does he give up everything for that one woman? And I think a lot of times we do is we look at those stories and go, I could never do something like that. And you may not do the same thing David did. He had a lot of political power. He could do and say and have whatever he wanted, and it really go somewhat unnoticed by the people. So you may not have the exact opportunity as David, but rest assured, if the man after God's own heart could do something like that, so could you. You can. You are capable of horrible things. I am capable of horrible things when I lack self-control. When I can't control my desires, I can do terrible things. You could do horrible things. I could do horrible things. We have to learn to control ourselves. We have to learn to fight our desires and our urges.